more than that. What? Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Ben.
How are you?
Good. How you holding up?
I'm holding up just fine. How about you all?
Yeah, I'm doing okay.
Excellent. Have you been to Flamingo Park yet?
I haven't.
But you know, well, I haven't been in, but it's like it's so lucky, aren't we? It's back open again.
Yeah, I just heard you have to wear a mask to go through.
Isn't that funny? Unless you're running or doing hard exercise. So that's the other thing to do is like go through.
I know. The mask has been bothering me. I have a scarf and I wrote a sign because I had to speak my mind. I wrote, "We are losing our freedom," and I taped it. So when I go to the grocery store, I have my mask with my sign. People probably think I'm a nut job, but you know what? I just can't not say anything.
Good for you. I really admire that. I think you're absolutely right.
I mean, I just feel like we're losing our freedom. I mean, my background is I have 25 years in the healing profession, you know, and
Here comes Doreen. Yep.
Yeah, this isn't how it works.
Yeah. There's Doreen. Hi, Doreen.
Hi, Doreen.
I think she's getting the audio going.
Yeah, she's connecting. Hi, Doreen.
Hi, Doreen.
Hello, how are you?
Good. So good to see you again. Lynn was just telling me that on her mask, she has something that's saying we're losing our freedoms or rights, right? Isn't that right?
Yeah, we're losing our freedom. That's what I wrote.
Excellent.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just bothering me. I was telling Ben, I said, I have 25 years in the healing profession and this isn't how it works, you know, and I don't like that someone's trying to dictate how we take care of ourselves. And it's a long time. I don't know what the heck they're thinking. And if you watch anything that's non-mainstream media, the numbers aren't there, you know, and they're still holding this crazy thing over us.
Here comes Mark. So I think we'll get to the book pretty soon, but let's talk more. Hey, Mark, how you doing?
We're all getting by.
Yes.
I see. Good. You got the right brand there, I see.
Yes.
So great. Well, there you are. So terrific to see you all. That's what here comes Miriam. That's what my brother told me at the very beginning, that he already had the virus because he loves Corona beer.
That's so funny.
Hi, Miriam.
I see we're together. I see Mark, Doreen.
Hi.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, and Lynn, I think you met at when you led the group earlier this year as well.
Exactly. Yes. Hi, everybody from New Hampshire.
Wow.
Oh, wow, New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Yeah, you win our furthest away award to this evening. Unless, Mark, you didn't tell us. Mark, are you here on the beach?
I am. I'm very local.
All right. So, well, great to see you guys. Do you want to exchange any other, current affairs, or should we get into the book?
Whatever people.
We might give another minute for people to join.
Yeah. Okay. Good idea. So we were just talking about the park being open. With Miriam down here, we just, I think, starting Wednesday, we had the parks opening up with a whole bunch of social distancing. But it's so nice to have our darling parks accessible again.
At least it's the first step in the right direction, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh. And how are things, Miriam, how are things in New Hampshire? I think you have a fairly low caseload, or are you influenced by Massachusetts?
we have a low caseload, but it's very high near the Massachusetts border.
Hmm.
There's still stay at home. The parks are open, but lots of social distancing. And downtown Concord is really empty and it's kind of eerie. All the shops are closed. Everything is closed. The library is closed. The legislature is not meeting. So the weather turned lovely and spring-like, so that's good. And we've been leading a very, very quiet life.
Yeah.
A lot of people on the street are wearing masks.
Yeah.
And you cannot enter a supermarket unless you have a mask on.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to share something really interesting about Zoom, since this was in today's paper, and there's a theatrical production, the Diary of Anne Frank, which, because it was planned in, I think, Minnesota, and it was supposed to launch in March, they said, okay, we can't do that live, and so they turned it into a Zoom production.
Oh, wow.
And so I hope to take a look at it this weekend, because they gave the link, and if it's any good, the review was incredible. So there you are. We now have a play production released using the Zoom technology. What will be next?
Wow.
Fascinating.
It is fascinating.
It is.
So
I think some of that will continue.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think so too.
It might have to continue for a while.
Yeah.
So guys, let's get going. I don't see anyone else, and I can see when someone wants to. They enter what's called the waiting room, and I'll let them in right away.
Thanks for
So-
doing it, Ben. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ben.
Well, I am just so delighted that that we're able to do this, and that you're all here, so we can all be together. My goodness. So as we do during the meeting, should we just go around and people give their top impressions?
I think
Whether
that
they liked, disliked, and then maybe we'll look at some questions. What do you think?
sounds good to me.
Me too.
Great. Well, Miriam, you have the honor of being furthest away. Do you want to start?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Where to begin? First of all, I have to keep in mind that Little Women is really young, very young adult fiction. It was not written for adults, though adults picked it up. The influence of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is enormous in this book. I can't help, I visited Orchard House, as some of you might have as well, and also have written about Louisa May Alcott. What impressed me was the focus on money, who has money and who does not have money. But I also felt in some ways the book was rather naive. It's unfair to compare Louisa May Alcott with Flaubert, but it's interesting that Madame Bovary was written in 1856, Anna Karenina in 1877, Little Women in 1868, Dickens' Great Expectations in 1861, but there's no, except perhaps for Dickens, there's not much influence or sophistication from these other writers. On the other hand, the tale does pull me in because the Civil War ripped this country apart, and I think of Little Women and its celebration of domesticity as a way to return to the home, to sweetness, to the figure of the mother. And I'll end with this for now. Louisa May Alcott was the one who went to Washington and became a nurse during the Civil War. Her father did not. So she saw that up close. She suffered greatly. She contracted typhoid, but that's a whole other story. And in this book, the father is pretty much off the scene, and it's centered on the mother.
Thank you, Mary. I don't know what order you are on your screen, but Mark, do you want to go next?
Okay. So I decided to read it because I saw the movie and really liked it. I had never read this book before, and I only have read the first part for this because I have been busier than expected. But I get enough of an impression. I mean, I guess I was a little bit surprised to see how kind of saccharine and didactic it could be in places. And the first, I was listening via audiobook, and the first one I listened to turned me off. I started a month ago, and I stopped listening because it was so sugary. Like her voice was oozing warmth and isn't this the sweetest thing ever kind of with the whole business. And I just couldn't, I was like, okay, this must be for younger people. But then I said, you know what, maybe a lot of it is the narrator. I switched to a more neutral one. And, I think who's telling the story has a lot to do with it, because I thought that the movie director, she told the story in a very contemporary kind of proto-feminist way, whereas the book actually reads more to me as very much a moral tale, but with some twisted morals. So I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts on it, and maybe I didn't get the full picture because I didn't read the whole thing. So.
All right, thanks, Mark. Ladies, I'll go last. So charge ahead.
Lynn, go ahead.
I didn't know what to expect when we started reading this book. I didn't know if I was going to like it because it's not normally something I would pick, and I loved it. I really enjoyed the story. And I don't know, the beginning really had me, I think, the most when they met with the neighbor Laurie and the grandfather, and the connection with the grandfather and Beth and the piano, that whole thing. I mean, I cried when I read that. It was just so moving. I just thought that was such a touching aspect. I think I liked part one better than part two. But I enjoyed all of it. There was a lot of things that I could probably talk about, so.
Great. Doreen?
So I read this book when I was little, and in fact, the version that I was reading was a book that my Aunt Anne gave me in 1967.
Oh, wow.
And it's an illustrated version. I don't know if you can see.
Yes.
And it's
Wonderful.
full of color illustrations.
Nice.
Yeah. Put her on speaker.
Some black and white ones with every chapter. Let's see. Like the engraving type.
Yes.
Hey.
That's
And
amazing.
it was a little actually hard to read because in those days they didn't have much space between the lines. Like now our books have bigger words and more space between the lines, and my eyes actually hurt from reading this because of the version. This was one of my favorite books growing up. I wanted to be Jo. When I read this book, I thought, that she was this independent character and she was going to do what she wanted to do, and she wrote books, and I love to write, and I was going to be Jo. And I thought it was this liberation kind of book. And when I reread it now, so many years later, at the beginning, I was like, what the hell is this? How did I see that in the book? And my focus now as a 60-something-year-old woman was on the mom and not on the daughters.
Yes.
And the advice that the mother gave them, to be happy and not necessarily worry about money. And so that was really interesting, just to see how you perceive a book differently at different stages in your life. I didn't like it at first, and by the end I loved it, because I think that the more and more you get into it, the way that she characterizes relations between people, like there were certain scenes there where couples were fighting, and you go through maybe like 10 different emotions in 10 minutes, and she nails it, just like waiting for him to give that answer, and then pissed off that he didn't give that answer, and then excited that he gave that other answer, and then the emotion that you feel, and just the way she captures emotions and relations between couples, friends, sisters. I feel like that's probably why the book still endures, because it really has, she really nails those emotions.
She does.
So yeah, I really loved it for that reason, even though it has many shortcomings and is very much a product of its age and some parts didn't age well. That emotional specificity that you can relate to so much just drew me in.
Great. All right. Well, I'll just add a few words. I love it that we're all here talking about, you know, a book that's really from a long time ago. This is at the earliest of the range that we read at the Wolf Book Club, right? Because we're from 1850 until 1950. For me, I too had read it sometime in my distant past. I don't remember when, but as often happens these days, I picked it up and said, I think I read this before. But for me, it was the perfect quarantine busting book possible. I loved it. There's something escapist about it. And here we are, at least, you know, I'm with my dog. Some of you have partners with you. But for me, the whole thing of just like being surrounded by the March family was so loving and warm. There's all sorts of points that I look forward to getting to along the line of some of the discussion points. But I just wanted to add, Mark, I agree. The audio version really can make a difference. I listened to Mar-a-Lago, and I didn't like the narrator. He had like a TMZ kind of, you know, voice. And so it really impacted how I liked or disliked the book. And I'll just add a personal note. I spent my tweens and teens growing up in Concord, Mass.
Wow.
So I went by and the Alcott house often. And back then, I think you probably would have had to kill me to get me to read the book. I don't remember when I did, but I really appreciated it. And trying to put it into its context, one of the interesting things, for me, it is nowhere near as sophisticated as European novels of that period.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still there's not the polish there. I think there's psychological insights galore, as Doreen pointed out, but there's something just so authentic and sincere and American about it, away from European sophistication, that it also greatly appealed to me. But let me get off my soapbox for now.
I hear what you're saying very much. Yeah, very American book.
Yeah,
Very.
Post-Civil War.
and it's an amazing thing to realize that the Civil War is treated so lightly. You're not really, you know, at all involved in what it was really like to be at the very end of the war or afterwards. It was completely, in some ways, escapist, but as you pointed out, focusing on a family and an incredible mother. But now Doreen did bring up some reasons why the book might have so many legs. I couldn't believe it in Publix last week. There's a Life magazine with what else on the cover? Little Women. So I think it's from the recent film release. So how about some more thoughts on why is this book continually remade for every generation and it remains entirely in front of us?
I think a lot does have to do with the figure of Jo Marsh, the independent young woman. That really mirrors Louisa May Alcott's life. She did not marry. She lived a very independent life. She really became the sole support of her family. And she was the one who, in a sense, rescued her mother, paid the bills, took care of an orphan niece, all that. Now, why does it have legs? I was reading recently a review of a recent book on Simone de Beauvoir. Well, it turns out that Simone de Beauvoir loved this novel and she loved the character of Jo. So I think one of the reasons is that Jo is feisty. Mm-hmm. And independent and vigorous, and she also has a career. She's a writer. And all of that is so interesting to me in the book, how she finally sells the story, makes connections to editors, and works for money. She's a working woman, as her mother was, actually. Louisa May Alcott's mother was a working woman. She was a social worker in Boston. So all that's interesting, the career of the writer who goes up into the attic, munches on her apples, and works.
Well, the funny thing, I just might add, at the end of the book, it's almost as though she's given up her career. But I think we can assume that no, there was a post, narrative Joe who then actually did write. But anyway, what do others think in terms of why there's so many legs here?
I guess it's basic. I mean, it's basic. I was trying to figure that out too. I think it's just basic relationship stuff that never changes, right? And the dynamics of life and emotions that you deal with. I mean, some people say it might be a little Pollyanna, but I loved how the mother helped the girls understand their emotions and how to deal with them. I thought, man, if I had somebody talking to me about my emotions when I was growing up, that would have been amazing. We didn't talk about that stuff. So I don't know, I guess maybe that's why, because it just, when it comes down to it, it doesn't matter what time in what year it is, they're the kind of the same basic things we all go through.
I would agree with that. And I think Doreen said similar appeal of the psychological insights and emotional insights. I feel like it's, taking Jane Austen, the Austen's literature, and adapting it down for children, bringing it down to the child level. So, I think that the kids, the young adults who read it fall in love with it well before they know that Joe becomes an independent career writer. I think at first she's just a feisty child amongst a group of children, and it's sort of a Sound of Music, all in the big family kind of feel to it that is appealing. But it's all done with the one element that I really liked in the book a lot was that Austen real acuity of emotion and nuance and distinguishing. Characters are really able to be distinct and come to life. Even if you don't necessarily, it takes a while maybe to sort of separate out to develop some of the characters. By the end, I think they all have very, nice, they're nicely developed, and the emotional nuance, I think, works very well. And that becomes, I think, probably a good frame for what, you're saying, Miriam, is like out of all of this emerges this really, feminist icon life at a time when it was radical, or seems radical.
But it's also interesting, like, had it only been Joe instead of 4 women, I don't know if the book would have the same power. Because though she loves Joe, and she clearly is Joe, and there's also a choice that you could be any of these other, and the whole family wouldn't be one were there not all of them. And
she rises out of that, right? She's different
from if you choose to be feminist, that's okay. But for example, the other day a friend called. She's 90 something years old, my mom's friend, and my friend now too. And she's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm reading Little Women. She said, oh, I read Little Women when I was a child, and it was one of my favorite books. And I named my daughter for one of the characters in the book. And I thought, oh, of course, Joe. And she said, I named my daughter Beth.
Yeah, yeah.
And her daughter died. Her daughter died at age 20.
Oh, wow. That's too
And
ominous.
I thought I was just going to I was so floored.
Wow.
Because it never occurred to me to name my child Beth. Beth was the one person in the book I would never have named my child.
I agree. I felt the same. As soon as you said that, I'm like, I almost feel like it was cursed.
I know.
Well, no, I can see the...
But piety, familial duty, perhaps those are the values that this woman, age 90-something, was brought up with. And
Beth is a saint.
Yes.
Exactly. It's the loving self-sacrifice, and Jo, in fact, I think becomes a fuller woman by admiring and then walking in Beth's steps. So it's complex. I just wanted to add that during this quarantine, it's an emotional time for all of us. Maybe I'm particularly emotional now, but almost every chapter, not every, but almost, I teared up. Because there's a connection that occurs. There's a psychological insight. There's again perhaps a self-sacrificing love that is shown between the characters that was truly inspiring. So.
And it is Jo who nurses Beth, who carries her to the couch, who stays with her, who sees her through it. And I think that's one of the reasons the book has legs, is the character of Beth pulls us in with a great deal of sympathy. Great deal.
Now, can I stop on the Beth character for a second and ask one of the things that bothers me about it in terms of the morals? Yeah. So here you have the most saintly character who dies as a result of going and doing the most charitable thing of going to see to help the poor family, and catches the disease from them. And so and then you have the other Amy, who's the kind of the opposite temperament in some ways from Beth, and who's more materialistic, is motivated to get the ring in every respect from the beginning till the end. She wants the ring. And then she gets the ring. She gets the big mansion and the prize. She wins it all. And so is that just like a fatalistic, this is the way the world is, but it's still, you still admire the saint who dies young rather than, or even more perhaps, than the one who goes for the wealth and more superficial things? I mean, that's why I found the morals a little bit harder to digest than I did in the movie. In the movie, I don't think I dwelled on that.
Mm-hmm.
I've got an idea, and it really takes off on what Doreen said, that none of them would have achieved their various successes without the others, in the sense that they all were influenced heavily by the others. And so I don't see it as fatalistic, but rather it's saying there's a real mix of experiences, and if you're open to them, then you will be a much better person as a result. So I don't, and we'll get to a little bit when we get to the castles in the air, but even Amy gets transformed by the end, so that she, even though she weds with the wealthy man, she seems like a different woman by the end, and no longer materialistic. And I will just say, I was amazed at how non-materialistic the book was, because Mrs. March, the whole way, is like, girls, I don't care if you marry a rich man. It doesn't matter to me. Sure, that can be ennobling, I think, the way she put it. But I want you to be who you are going to be and be happy with it. So if you're poor and happy, like Meg, let's say, with Mr. Brooke, fantastic. So
that's what I'm talking about, is the divide between the preaching of it, which I think is wonderful. It adds it gets a little much sometimes. It's little, it's just right out there giving the Christian moral lesson of every little event. But look at the big picture of it. 2 out of the 4 end up wealthy and completely transformed from their lower middle class lives. The saintly one dies early because of her charitable acts, and the other one marries for love's sake and is left out of the will, right? Of the aunt's will. Or maybe I didn't read far enough to know if she got back in it or not, but at least she was threatened to be out of it. So I don't, it just seems to me that, yes, that's all there, and the preaching and the morals are there, but when you look at the story pattern, it almost, it defies that.
I don't know, because I felt like the idea of philanthropy and doing for others was central to the book, right? It starts off where they're giving their food away.
Yes.
And at the end of the book, Joe is educating all of these ragamuffins, and Lori's paying for it, and Amy's giving scholarships to art students who are women. So to me, you know, and I think America's known for philanthropy, right? Whether it's, you know, charitable giving, donations, foundations. And I felt like that aspect of, you know, giving was what they were talking a lot about, what wealth was. Because the Marches never could have been who they were without Lori's help or with Aunt March's help. So even though there was wealth, there was this also this notion of like the importance of giving.
Absolutely. And I think that the characterization of Beth as this saintly figure is imbued with this Christian ideal. In other words, to see her as a saintly person gives meaning to her life. And because of her, it's as if all the sisters somehow, their souls, if I may use that word, become enlarged by that.
Mm-hmm.
And they endure. They certainly live through it. They live through it.
So it's a Christ figure in a way. Yeah.
Yes. I also want to say about Marmee, I love the section in which she advises her married daughter, who's giving everything to her children, to start paying attention to her husband. So isn't that a wonderful section? She has the most level-headed advice, you know. And here's the mother whose children are so important to her, and she's saying, hey, pay attention to your husband and then he'll stay home. I love that section.
But let's segue to that. I'm going to add one thing to just sort of throw in a thought. One of the reasons perhaps for the universality of this book and why it has so many legs is in some ways perhaps the four daughters are different paradigms of women. And so again, it's like they're part of every woman, each of those different characters. So I'm just going to put that out there. But Mrs. March agreed entirely, particularly in March in book one or part one. She is just dominating. And so my question was, is she too good to be true?
Well, I like to believe that there are people like that. She never loses her cool, does she?
No.
And she's just constantly loving, but she's no patsy. In other words, she sees her daughter. She's very, very realistic, and she doesn't. Let's put it this way: she's not raising a whole bunch of narcissists.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
And she's not a helicopter mom. She actually says in chapter 26, experience was an excellent teacher.
Yes.
So she lets them make mistakes.
Oh, does she ever? Does she ever? Yeah. She does, yeah. Yeah. And she's absolutely steady. Absolutely steady.
Now, of course, back in chapter 9, and this is rather controversial, but I think it gets at perhaps the heart of her character. She tells her daughters that to be loved and chosen by a good man is the best and sweetest thing that can happen to a woman. Now, obviously, this is no longer au courant, but she goes on that, but I never want you to think it is the first or only prize, talking about richness, or to strive for. I'd rather see you poor man's wives, if you were happy, beloved, contented, than queens on thrones. Mm-hmm. So, and how amazing is that? Because after all, and we'll get maybe to a little bit of Pride and Prejudice later, instead of the mother pushing, like, you have to recuperate us to from our fallen position, you have to marry rich in order to make the family whole. She is saying no by both example and the talk, saying I am wonderfully happy as I am with my poor husband. who, by the way, became poor because he was too charitable. I guess he tried to help out an unfortunate friend, and the family somehow lost whatever money they had.
So I hope that Mrs. March isn't too good to be true. Like I want to think that we can reach that kind of, like you think of a grown woman and wisdom, like I felt like she was like this epitome of just like what like you look up to your elders because they're so wise. And I feel like I got that from her. And I even feel like even in that context about her saying you don't have to marry rich, I don't even like, or it's the sweetest gift to find that kind of love. I don't feel like if you read the whole thing, she doesn't make it about just that's your only thing in life. I feel like there was a context with it that it was kind of from a good place, because I wouldn't have liked that if she only said that was the only thing you had to look for. And there was a couple things too with Beth. I was kind of frustrated with the character because I wanted her to try or to have a different mindset or to grow herself and not just give in to being a sickly person. That bothered me. And then I thought also with Amy, I know she was about the money, but I almost felt like it was coming from a good place because she kind of wanted to rescue her family so they didn't have to struggle anymore. She thought that was the way she could give back if she brought a wealthy man into the picture. So I don't feel like it was just about the money. It was about how she could help with it. So.
And along those lines, I'd like to ask, and this is a little bit towards the second question that I put, is how prototypical are these American women, and does that explain in part for the nation's meteoric rise in the century after this book? And so there, I think it's all the way over in chapter 37 that we get all these stereotypes about different nationalities. We get haughty English, and in fact, I think they're not very far from today. Haughty English, lively French, sober Germans, handsome Spaniards, ugly Russians, and then free and easy Americans. And so what are the things, and perhaps what is Alcott getting at? What is it about the American women that is so different that expresses something that then makes a huge national difference?
I think their independence, Joe's independence certainly. Henry James wrote a book called The Americans, and it has to do with the whole circle that the Alcotts were involved in, the Transcendentalists, the Temple Bookstore in Boston and such. And he was a little, how shall I say it, befuddled, troubled, but the notion of the American girl as being independent, I think, is something different, very, very different.
And there's a certain self-improvement going on.
Well, that's from the earliest days of the Puritans. I mean, what they were, and I think that's part of that is in the book. The mother, calls Joe to task about her temper and her controlling her emotions. And it's as if there's a kind of stock taking. How did you do today? Did you overcome your faults? And the Puritans, of course, and that family, this family comes from that early Puritan tradition. You were supposed to keep a diary, and then you were supposed to, how did you do today? What were your faults today? Have you overcome your faults? And that diary keeping and that self-examination is part of this whole culture that Alcott's family was involved in, and certainly the mother as well. Definitely the mother as well. So it's a combination of independence and yet introspection. Examine your soul. How did you do today? And this is sort of outside the book. The Alcotts were really very radical. They went to Fruitlands, and Ben, you might have gone up there, a utopian community in Harvard, Massachusetts, where they were going to establish the ideal society. And it was really an early commune.
there was a lot of non-conventional behavior by the marches, even considering the time that they were in.
Yes.
So remember, I think one of the weddings was considered very unconventional. The putting together the boys' school at the end,
Yeah.
and including all races, very non-conventional. I think Joe was told that it would fail, and obviously it didn't. And so, yeah. And the Pilgrim's Progress is an interesting point, and hence why her really framing the entire book around Pilgrim's Progress. In a sense, this book is giving us an update on the Pilgrims 2 centuries before,
Yes.
and what progress they had made in the New World.
So that's an interesting point. I don't know that I have a comment on that because I don't remember enough about what Pilgrim's. I never read Pilgrim's Progress, but I was just looking up to see about Horatio Alger, and he was in fact starting to write in Boston, and then moved to New York City right around the same, right at the Civil War time, and then moved to New York City after those days. So there's something about that Horatio Alger spirit that was maybe of the times in Boston and New York. And because there's, so in that sense, you can understand the girls moving from poverty to this benevolent, wealthy, enlightened state, as like the paradigm of American social mobility. So maybe that resonates with us.
And something about the self-improvement, I was amazed, remembering that both Joe and Meg left school in order to start working after the father's fall, and that they, so the only one who goes to school is Amy. Beth apparently never set foot in school, and yet. And maybe this is Alcott pushing it a little bit hard. They seem extremely well educated. The number of references to philosophers, to novelists, to theatrical releases, granted, many of them by Joe, who's the best read, but they were given in a way that one has to believe that most of the family was understanding all, or most, if not all, of her references. So this is another shock that compared to what we consider a good education today, they all were extremely well educated without doing anything in a conventional sense by today's standards.
Yeah, and they were educated at home. And of course, that's Louisa May Alcott's background. And then, then Concord, Massachusetts, there was Emerson, there was Thoreau, there were all of these people. There were the Transcendentalist Club, and they were all exchanging ideas, all of them talking. And Louisa May Alcott was part of that. And the mother was very well educated and well read, all of them. And the father was a teacher. He was radical, no corporal punishment, and other things as well. So they're a very interesting radical group.
Yeah. All right. Well,
did they mention that they didn't go to school? I don't remember reading what I was trying to figure out. I'm like, do they go to school, or what are they working? Like, I was trying to figure out their daily when they were talking about it.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, it is mentioned that there we go. Here's another here's a quote from chapter 4. They could not begin too early to cultivate energy, industry, and independence. And that was the comment on both Joe and Meg essentially stopping schooling in order to start making a living. So,
Okay.
So the idea that you couldn't start too early. Now, granted, I always like to remember that George Washington, I think at age 12, went out and was a surveyor. So he was doing a real heavy, important and not easy job, man's work, if you will, at age 12, and that was not considered very strange back then. So there's maybe maturation has slowed down a lot since those days. So, but how about, speaking of maturation, how about the castles in the air? Because do you remember, I think it's back in what chapter was this? In chapter 13, we learn of the dreams of the four women, little women, and then by the end of the book, we get a very clear update on all those castles in the air. And I think if we remember, without going through every single one, except for Beth, all the girls had very ambitious castles in the air. And in some way or another, they are brought back to Earth through maturing, through their experiences. And in some ways, they accomplished their dreams, in fact, became better.
It's almost like the childhood dream that you have is not going to be like the adult dream because you don't understand the adult world. But it's almost like each dream matures and is in a way realized, right? Because like Laurie says, I want to have as much music as I choose. And he ends up with Amy, right? Who's the musician. Mm-hmm. He's not a famous musician himself, but at the beginning, he's like, I don't want to do anything. I just live for what I like. But in the end, he works, right? So he matures, but he does have that essential thing he wanted, which was music in his life.
Isn't Beth the musician?
Oh, I'm sorry. Beth is the musician.
No, Laurie is as well.
Amy's an artist.
Uh-huh.
Yes. And yes. Laurie is the musician. And he has art in his life, right? Not music, but art.
Yeah, Laurie is more like a composer. And Amy, the
yeah, I got it mixed up. Thank you, Mark. But
well, go ahead.
Their dreams mature, but they have elements of what they wanted from the beginning, but in a more mature version.
I mean, Joe says in chapter 42, which probably doesn't make it into the movie, but that give up ambitions and cheerfully give for others. And the funny thing about that is that that's her psychological, her emotional maturity to get to that point, which then, because we have the book as a result, allowed her to actually achieve ambitions later.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? So that she had to arrive at a certain point where she gave up her ambitions and decided to serve others. And only after that point was she able to achieve some old ambitions that have now been changed a little bit.
Yeah, and the way we would talk about it is that she takes her ego out of it and is thereby freed by doing that, which is interesting.
Yeah, and can this still, I mean, is this still valid today?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Definitely. Absolutely.
Another reason why the book maybe has legs.
Yeah, when the pursuit, whether it's in an artistic field or anywhere, when you let go of the self-seeking, it's a freeing act, and just concentrate on the job that needs to be done and then to do it. But without the ego, very freeing.
Yeah, and actually, and Mark, you made this point that the book did start out as a young woman's or young reader intention, but if I think I read it in an introduction that Alcott actually wrote the first part quite early in the 1790s, I believe, and she didn't publish it. And when she came back and then published it in 1813. And it was done serially, I believe, right? So that or no, rather, part one was published as a book, and then part two was published as a follow-up book. But that she had added much complexity and had changed the by that point. So maybe I'm getting confused. Is that Miriam? Do you recall? Is that the process here? I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice. Let me take it all back.
Dates are a little early. Little Women was published in 1868.
Yeah.
And before that, Alcott had a career. She published under a pseudonym, using the name Barnard as the last name. And she published what were called sensational stories, highly melodramatic, gothic, and she sold those and made money from those. And then recently, scholars have dug all that stuff up, and they showed this other side of her. Very dramatic, very gothic, very sensational stories. Probably a lot sexier than what we have in Little Women.
And as we know, Joe does.
That wouldn't be hard.
As we know, Joe goes through a similar experience when in New York, and it's only really perhaps Mr. Bears, which is, by the way, it's the most wonderful German character I've read in a while, and it's such a shame that due to the 20th century, you can't have such wonderful German characters. They're not allowed any longer, right? But it's so nice to see a German portrayed so lovingly and well.
Why is that? Why do you say that?
Oh, World War I and II. So,
is that true? Like they have to be careful how they describe people?
I'm exaggerating, but it's very hard to find a sympathetic German character in a lot of literature or movies or whatever today. So it's a broad generalization, but I really love seeing Mr. Bear. But so Joe dealt, and she came through then that sensationalist stories. And remember, she was told by the publisher or editor, you can't do stories with morals.
Right.
And so she made some money, she gained her independence, but as we know, she then went through a transformation where she essentially gave up writing, and only after the narration ends does she really come back to writing, and she's not writing sensationalist in Little Women, she's writing books with morals.
With morals.
So I wanted to say,
if you grew up listening to a mother giving you those kinds of morals left and right at every occasion, it would be really hard to find a purpose to writing that doesn't involve morals.
Yeah. And so here's the question: Can books still be written with morals today, or is this a time that was past? Alcott was already implying that at her time in the 1860s, maybe that time was already past.
I think there's commercial literature, and then there's other literature, right? I mean, a lot of what sells isn't commercial, it's sensational. Right? But that doesn't mean that you can't write with morals. I mean, I would venture to say that there's some sort of moral story or spiritual story or something that takes a book to another level, whether you call it morals or...
I would call it seriousness. I mean, that's a Susan Sontag term, but there's serious writing still going on. Definitely.
And there's Christian writing that, C.S. Lewis was totally in the same framework. He imbued all his, not all, but a lot of his books with the same, I mean, when you talk about the mother being too good to be true, I mean, she's in a sense false because she becomes the voice of all these, Christian morals, throughout. But no, it still lives, and his books are super popular, and that was 100 years later almost.
Yeah. Well, I'm heartened because today we have a lot of comic book stories, right, which are then made into movies, and those are like with big morals. in general, postmodernist writing stays away from morals, right? It tries to be a lot more subtle, to the point where there isn't that much of a moral. It's rather a study of man. And you think of all the stories and films that make us sympathize with bad people. So they've then separated storytelling from what was, you have to have a moral. So I agree there still is, but I'm glad that you think that there's still a place for it.
Well, we don't want to look at morals in a narrow sense. You have to think of it, I think, in terms of writers with a vision of good and evil. Mm-hmm. And I FaceTime with my 6-year-old grandson, mm-hmm. and he shares his various toys and whatever. And there's always the good guys and the bad guys. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, why is that guy bad? He says he does bad things. And, there's this sense of right and wrong. I think in our period, there are many writers who have a moral. I'm thinking of Philip Roth. His work is just imbued with a sense of right and wrong, and a sense of a world where good people suffer more than they deserve to suffer.
I was just thinking of postmodernism, like even something as simple as the Wicked Witch of the West story that's on Broadway. What is it? Wicked? Oh, right? It's like, okay, why is this person wicked? Maybe something bad happened to them. Mm-hmm. So that whole notion we have of the backstory of things now and turning it around and understanding why bad people are bad. And it's often because of abuse and trauma and betrayal.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'm encouraged. I mean, and if you think of it, there's also something peculiarly American about this. I mean, if you go to all of the westerns movies, and not so recent, but the ones that we all know from the 50s and so on, were all these titanic struggles between good and evil.
Yes.
That forms the American character. So there was something, I'm not sure, again, making the comparison with Europe, whether things quite worked out that way. There was something about our interaction with the new world that brought home an ethical, moral sense, which even today is very pronounced and makes us different from most people in the world.
But I would say this book is very different from some of the, where moral tales where the morality is at this really macro level. To me, this is all about morals, individual morals for child raising and for growing up and development and how you live your life. It's a very individualistic idea of morals. So it's if you look at the big picture, that's when I say I think it gets a little confusing, because you have the character who's doing good, the saintly character who dies, and and everyone else ends up well off, except for the one who just falls in love and gets and stays poor. So I don't know what the big moral themes are of the book, other than individual. The idea of individually living your life in a moral way and living for others and being influenced by others and serving others, and that kind of just and I keep saying Christian because I think this book is written as a Christian moral tale. So
I agree. And to pull a little more on the versus Europe.
Actually, I didn't feel that way at all.
Okay.
That it was Christian necessarily, because as opposed to Catholic, you mean?
No, I just mean Christian in the broad sense. They have both Catholic and Protestant represented there. In the Catholic character of the aunt's maid or servant or something or other who teaches Amy about
Oh, yeah.
Catholicism,
Yes, Amy
and she translates it into the idea that it's, hey, it's, you know, all Christians can find the same things. It's just our methods are a little different.
Yeah, no, and Mark, I agree with you. There's Christian proverbs and maxims throughout the entire book, you know, that are repeated directly by Mrs. March or by the daughter. So I agree with you entirely that it's heavily Christian influenced. I wanted to pull a thread on the European comparison and the idea that the one other book out there that's about marrying your daughters off well is Pride and Prejudice.
Yes.
And I don't know if any of you have recently read that, but if you wanted to think about it, I actually, since I have a little more time on my hands than usual, I actually reread Pride and Prejudice this week.
Oh, wow.
It's an earlier book by what, 4 decades or so, but it's really, really, really different. Even if the meme overall, bearing your daughters off well, is the same between the two. Do any of you have thoughts?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, the comparison of the mothers, if I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I've read Pride and Prejudice, but Mrs. Bennet, right? She's this ditzy mother, right?
She's a horror show.
She's a horror show. She's an airhead, right?
Uh-huh.
Doesn't get it right at all.
She's a middle-class bourgeois who's completely fixated on changing class.
Yes.
Or rising above her level, and makes a complete fool of herself and everyone around her almost continuously.
Right, right. And isn't there one of the daughters who runs off with a very unsuitable person, and that's the great scandal in the family, right?
Lydia, and that almost sinks the rest of their prospects, because had she actually eloped and never married,
yeah, she eloped and never married, then she has to be rescued, and it's
right.
What it brings home is the danger that a woman is in if she does such a thing.
Yeah.
Acts on her emotion and runs off, you know, thinking that, yes, we're going to get married. Yeah.
Do others of you remember Pride and Prejudice, or saw a recent adaptation? Because that's another one that has a lot of legs.
I don't think I've read it.
Well, I'll just give for me, what was amazing, it's Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen, it's certainly more polished. But in the end, it seems to me that it's much more frivolous a book. Because it's really, okay, our protagonists, Mr. Darcy and Lizzie, have to overcome their own pride and prejudice, and they're transformed by love and by each other's criticisms to be able to do that. But pretty much that's the story of how individuals can overcome pride and prejudice, and the rest of the story is just a bunch of romance. So it's like a page turner romance, but it just seems kind of frivolous in comparison to Little Women.
It's ironic. I mean, Jane Austen casts a very ironic, cool eye on marriage and money and the position of women and all of that. So it has that ironic sophistication that Little Women does not have, just doesn't have it.
It's true. And again, maybe that's European versus American. So there's with Alcott, there's like a lack of putting on airs, whereas I get the feeling that Jane Austen was very much paying attention to all of the literature around her and was coming up with the dialogue is incredibly witty and cutting and sophisticated, but all to the purposes of I'm not sure.
Well, for me, it comes down to what they share is this acute, analysis, or I would call it a kind of a feminine analysis of emotion and thinking and then the limitations and opportunities that are available to women. So, I think they share a good bit. I mean, I would be shocked. I haven't read anything about it, but I would be shocked if Alcott did not read Austen.
I got the sense that there's like a lot more idealism and social mobility in Alcott that you might not have in Europe.
Exactly.
Sure.
Right? Because the class system there and the opportunities there are much more well defined over generations, if not centuries. And in the US, in contrast, you can make more, or at least until recently, maybe, you had an opportunity to define yourself more by how you lived, and not only by who you married and what your last name was, and class and title, and carried less weight than European with the aristocracy tradition. And maybe that accounts for why the books are so different.
And one thing I'll add is Austen, she is more sophisticated, and she uses irony, but it's almost as though she's laughing at many of her characters and wants us to laugh with her.
Yes.
Or to wink and look a little bit down, because she's also skewering class pretentiousness of people like Mrs. Bennet. And it's like, don't be phonies is kind of Austen's message. It's like, be happy, whatever your class is, be authentic, but don't make a fool of yourself. And you get, at least I got the idea that a lot of people were making fools of themselves in Pride and Prejudice. But again, maybe that's human nature. So maybe I'm just giving too much of a European class system read on it.
Oh no, I think it's accurate. That's accurate.
Yeah. There's a lot more earnestness in Little Women.
Yeah.
A lot less game playing.
So, well, are there any other questions here that you have, or that we didn't look at so far?
I have one thing that I was curious to see what everybody else thought. How did you feel about Laurie, professing his love to Joe? And then she turned him down. I couldn't tell if she really meant it or not. And then he ends up falling for Amy. I don't know. I just was uncomfortable with the switch. Did anybody feel that?
Doreen.
It's so funny. Yesterday, I met up with Ben briefly, and the first thing I said to him was like, what do you think about Joe marrying Bear? And he's like, wait, save that for tomorrow. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I really had wanted her to be with Laurie. And Ben said something like, no, they weren't, for each other. And what did you say? The mom had said they had
They were
two similar.
Joe and Laurie were too similar.
And, it was better. But there was like a part of me that would have liked them to be together.
I found Laurie a one-dimensional character somehow. He just never convinced me. Yeah, the portrayal of Laurie seemed to me unreal. I don't know if anybody shared that as well.
So you mean you feel like he wasn't as deep as Joe was? Like he was a little more superficial than Joe. Joe was so much more.
I think, yes, it's superficial, but I think that Louisa May Alcott had difficulty portraying that male character. She somehow or other, he one-dimensional. That's all I can say. He seemed a very one-dimensional character. She doesn't seem to really get at him from the inside. But that's my reading of it. That's my reading of it.
Yeah, I agree that the book is really about women, and Laurie comes off a little bit short. He's actually referred to as in a slightly fun way. He's called like a Lord of Creation, which then seems like Alcott's commentary on young wealthy boys, because he takes a little longer to mature as well than the ladies do. And so he's a little Lord Fauntleroy in some ways. Now he does go through his it's Amy's uprating him
Yes.
that actually brings him into some level of maturity. So he gets a little more complicated, but not that much more complicated. I agree.
Her speech to him is really sharp.
Yeah.
Really sharp, and it wakes him up somehow.
Yeah.
It does.
I think it's sort of the New Yorker's view of the world. You know, it's all, you're seeing everything through the female lens, and you learn about Laurie because he manages to work himself in to be one of the girls.
Yes.
And so in that sense, you're
exactly, Mark. Yeah.
You're seeing him as a peer and interactive, force with all of the others. But she doesn't really try to, the men are kind of out there, strange creatures to be, dealt with, except for the father who comes in and becomes like the other moral, paragon, but also kind of an artificial character when he's there that you don't really get to know the father, I don't think.
No,
so,
very, we don't know him at all.
I just don't think the men are the focus of this, book at all.
I felt like I was able to kind of come full circle with it a little bit with the ending. Like I felt like I could see Joe and the professor together, like they were more like an intellectual match.
Mm.
And then I felt like Laurie and Amy, maybe there was a little bit like they needed to grow a little bit as people, and that's why they got the child who was sickly, right? Who they had, that kind of woke them both up. And I thought that kind of brought everything home. So I felt like I could be okay with it. But I was really struggling. I'm thinking, do you think she ever loved Laurie and just denied it like that? Or just always thought of him
maybe
as a brother?
she loved him as the way you love a buddy as a child.
Or a brother, like a brotherly kind of friend.
And I could see why she could say, no, that's not for the next stage of my life what I want. And I could come to terms with Laurie saying, I'll take the sister. Mm-hmm. Because it happens.
Well, look at it from the author's point of view. There is no way that she's going to marry the character that is most like her, off to a wealthy neighbor. She is definitely going to go out and make it on her own. So there's no chance that she's going to, because of the perspective of the author, there's no chance that she's going to fall for this guy. And it almost becomes like a proof that she's not all about, just marrying up for money, right? She's loves them in a different way as a peer and a, child, a youthful colleague and, a kid who gets into trouble and has the same playfulness as a child, as a teen that she does. But then, she has to make it on her own. And so we get this other character who's, strong in that he will challenge her intellectually and make her, prompt her to change her writing. But I wonder, for those who read it, and I only saw it through the movie, does the German character become a real rounded character, or is he also kind of a cardboard foil for Joe, whose main role is just to be a good guy who's decent and speaks the truth, and because of that, she gets all flustered and then later gradually warms back up to the fact that he might have been right after all.
I'm sorry. I think the men are kind of foils in that sense, that they bring out different parts of the women in the story. And yes, Mr. Bear, I think, is fairly well developed, but it's really about what transformation he helps Joe go through. And I just wanted to add, I might have mentioned this to Doreen yesterday. There's a backstory a little bit on the book that the first part was published first, and then it was so hugely popular that there was demand for part 2, or another book, to be published. It was named Good Wives at first as a separate published publication, but that apparently Alcott specifically went out to unfulfill the reader's expectations from the first book. And so knowing that many people would want Laurie and Joe to get together, she intentionally then took it elsewhere. And personally, as I responded to Doreen yesterday, I think it was more fulfilling because there was something very sweet about Joe and Mrs. Bear doing their project together and having a different kind of spiritual love that I think it really was a childhood or even passionate love between Joe and Laurie that isn't as attractive as the union at the end of the book.
Well, what is clear is that Mr. Bear, Hare Bear, is manly, not boyish.
True.
Yeah, very manly. And
what is he, 10 years older than Joe? It's not quite clear, but she's 30.
Like 15, I think. 15 years older.
Okay. Still a young sprite then at 45. Marrying Joe at 30.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So,
but he's a very appealing character.
Yeah. So good question, Lynn. Any others or thoughts?
Well, just a couple of scenes that I appreciated. I liked the whole milieu of the boarding house in New York. And that the character gets to New York, lives in a boarding house, all the details about the room that she's in, the table, the meals, all of that was so interesting to me. And I also was interested in the book. There's such an emphasis on clothes and what people are wearing. Did anyone notice that?
Well, it was to show status, right?
Oh, absolutely. The hats and the dresses and all of that is so important, so important.
And that can coexist with 4 women and the mother as well, who seem to be extremely well read.
Yes.
So today we think about, okay, either you're like a fashion stud and that's all you can see, or you're well read. But back then, no, it was all together.
Absolutely. It was in terms of education, it was a serious household. Their frame of reference was really broad.
And I just wanted to add, like, just in terms of the fun of the book, they gave you New York and they gave you Europe, right? So you traveled with this book.
Yes.
Right? So it had like all the different aspects of things that you like in literature, right? They take you to new worlds and, it had romance, it had travel, it had fashion, it had literature. There was all the elements that make novels exciting.
Doreen, you're saying that it's sensationalist.
It doesn't have to be sensationalist. It just it touches on all those aspects,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that too.
She was definitely a crowd pleaser. I mean, so Alcott was writing to an audience. I think from doing all her sensationalist writing, she knew how to please a crowd. But then she added a whole bunch more to that, is perhaps what makes it so enduring.
This is the ideal household. It's, with the mother at the center, this intelligent mother who speaks very, very well. Notice her diction is impeccable when she's giving her advice to her girls. So it's an idealized world, and the book was wildly successful. I mean, it just flew off the shelves. Yeah.
And it still is. There was a theatrical production of this as well, if I'm not mistaken, several years ago.
Yeah, that I'm not familiar with, but so successful.
So,
Mark, did you like the movie? The one that was, is that with Meryl Streep?
I really did. I found it nicely moving and very empowering and relevant to today. And so that's why initially I had a little trouble with the book itself, because it seemed, to have so much of the elements of the 19th century in it. But I thought that the director, she did a wonderful job.
Is that Greta Gerwig?
Yeah. Which, if you haven't seen, what was her movie with Lady Bird? Another nicely done movie of hers.
I have seen that. It was
quite
lovely.
good.
Yeah.
And her first film, Frances Ha, is really wonderful.
I haven't seen it, but it's on my list to
Oh,
see. It's on Netflix or something.
It's absolutely terrific, and it's about a young woman finding herself, and it's just beautifully done. It's my favorite.
Yeah. I think I love the movie because it's someone who obviously loved the book from an early age and found a way to bring that spirit to life. And so I love the spirit of it. And I think if I'd read the book instead of listening to it, or read it all at once, as you were able to do in a, unfortunately I don't have the situation. I'm busier now than I was before the shutdown, but I think if I read it in that way or experienced it earlier or whatever, I would feel that. And the movie conveyed that feeling that I think a lot of people love about the book.
Well, there was an earlier movie version. Has anyone seen it and recall when it was? Was it 1950s or something?
I did not.
No.
I'll look into it, because I believe this wasn't the first film adaptation. But
no, I think it's done every 15 years or so.
There we go.
And I may have mentioned this before, but there's also a book called March, which imagines the life of the father. Has anyone read it? By Geraldine Brooks, the Pulitzer Prize winning author. It's historical fiction, and it's brilliant. It imagines the life of the father and what his life was like at war, what it was like in the hospital, what the whole Civil War was like. And I recommend it.
Great, Doreen. What a good input. My goodness, we have such a well-read and culturally hip and on top of the group here.
That's a great note. I'm looking that up as we speak. I love that idea. The absent father, to write it from his perspective, and by a woman as well, who might have been very well influenced by Little Women.
That's a good idea. Good idea. Aside from literary matters, how is everyone doing during the pandemic? I'd love to know. How are you doing?
Lynn, you go first.
I'm doing okay. I'm just ready for it to be over. I think it's long enough.
I've got my daughter at home graduating college next week, in theory.
Congrats.
Yeah, and so we're running a small office here with my wife's teaching, and I'm busy, and my daughter's finishing up her stuff. So we're really like crazy busy in a good way. So we haven't had time to get so bored and frustrated with the shutdown. I mean, just empathetic to the tragedy of it, but no.
Why are you so busy, Mark? Are you busier than usual, you said?
Well, my work I do policy work with the school district, and it's been a super busy time for policy and federal policy, and yeah, it's a time where everything is kind of up in the air, and so it's just been busier than usual.
Yeah. So it's
usually stuff is so slow, and now it's like unbelievably exponentially fast.
It's funny, Miriam, for me, with my writer's routine, it's actually didn't change my days very much. But at the same time, it's a bit of an oppressive feeling. And the lack of direct human contact really does have an impact. So actually seeing Doreen yesterday was terrific, because besides bumping into people in my apartment building, I'm theoretically, as I pointed out to Doreen, we're not supposed to have any gatherings of any number of people inside or outside, private or public. And so it's a little bit oppressive. At the same time, I am kind of with that Chinese proverb that where there's pain, there's opportunity. Where there's challenge, there's opportunity. And I'll just share on a personal note, last week, a step-uncle died of the disease alone at a hospital in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And that's tough.
My condolences.
Thank you. So, you know, to think that that is tough because, and maybe it was tougher on his close family members, on his three kids and all his siblings. Maybe it was tougher on them because, in a sense, thank God the disease is fast. So he was airlifted from a hospital in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, by prior agreement. You know, bad COVID cases had to go up to Idaho, and maybe within a number of a few days, he was already on a ventilator, nearly died immediately, and then was on sedation. So he made it for another 19 days. So perhaps he didn't feel so alone. But imagine that the kids and the really close people that there's no way that you can see him. And there's no way you can be there next to him. And so sedated for the last 19 days of his life, there's also no way to communicate with him. So, you know, things are tough. A younger brother and his entire family got the disease up in Rowayton, Connecticut. My niece, his oldest daughter, came back from Harvard from spring break, and she got it first, so she probably brought it from there. Luckily, they all made it through. The man of the house had a tough time. My younger brother had 2 weeks of high fever before it broke. Whereas the kids were like, you know, the daughter who brought it, she was just 3 days out of it, or with some fevers. The wife got it, and she had lower fevers. But some men react particularly poorly, apparently. But so things are not fun, but at the same time, then I really am appreciating the incredible beauty of a day like today, the opportunity to get together with friends like you and discuss great literature. So there's also a lot of great things occurring. So it's not easy, but together we'll make it through.
Together we'll make it through. Definitely, definitely. It was so good to get together.
This was nice. I'm glad everyone was here.
How are you, Miriam?
Well, it feels a little bit unreal. I'm here with my partner, John Lane, and we're lunching and dining together. And John said to me today, he said, we haven't really done this for years. And it's a bit like a vacation or being on an island somewhere. Our family lives close by, but we haven't seen them. They're being super careful. My son's a photojournalist. He's out in the field. He goes out wearing super protective equipment, eye goggles, and one of the really secure masks and everything. So he believes it's just not a good idea. So we FaceTime, we Zoom, we do all of those things. But what you said, Ben, about not having ordinary contact, Concord is a very civil place. People usually say good morning, good afternoon. You chat with people on the street. All of that has disappeared, and I realized how much I miss it. Today, I took my walk, which is up a very, very steep hill, not what we have in Miami Beach, certainly. I got near the top, and there was a woman out, and she was digging. She had a good spade, and she was digging in her garden. She had a raised bed, and she looked very, very happy, and she gave me a big, big hello. We were 6 feet apart, or maybe more, and I said, that soil looks really good. And she said, it is, and I'm discovering lots of worms. And she was ecstatic. And I think part of it, she'd been in her house all day. Then she sees this person with the sun hat laboring up the hill. And it was an odd thing. It's like we had the connection was so rich, and it only lasted for seconds. But that's the first time that happened in days and days and days, because there's nobody around, What do I miss? There's a lovely cafe downtown where I used to love to take my notebook. and have a coffee and one of their delicious pastries and just sit there. Lots of people in there with their computers working, wonderful view out to the street. That place is closed, and I don't miss restaurants, but I miss that one cafe. Like Ben, I'm also a writer, so that hasn't changed much. You know, we spend a lot of time alone, but then we break out and we talk to people and we hug them, and but that's all gone.
For
And I,
now, for now.
yeah, miss that.
I hope we don't lose our humanity. You know, it's just so sad to me watching everyone so afraid of each other right now, and so much distancing, and people walking around with the masks. And I'm like, I just hope we come out of that and don't carry that part with us. It's just really breaking my heart seeing that.
Yeah, you know, and we're I mean, I feel privileged because I have a dog, so it means that I can go out 3 times a day with my dog and then see people. I can go exercise also, and I tend to do runs or rollerblades, and particularly on the runs around South Point and whatnot. I try to say good morning to every single person. Now, a lot of them have their earbuds on, or you know, they're like, oh, la, la, la. And I can see, you know, people were looking really scared.
Yes.
And you know, they're opening up a little bit now, and I appreciate the opportunity to just be, you know, a big foolish neighbor who says, hi, good morning. So that, and I get to go to the grocery store also. So you know, I'm not complaining. I get to get outdoors with some frequency, but still, it ain't easy. And how
Yeah, so I lost my job 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
I teach English as a second language, and I love it because I love to see the students improve and their self-confidence, and we have a pretty tight-knit community. So we switched to online teaching, but many of the foreign students left to you know, pass the rest of the virus in their respective countries, and there's no new students coming in. So there were too many teachers for the number of students. And they consolidated our students from our Miami Beach locale into larger schools in the chain. So I was able to teach online for 4 weeks, and then I lost my job. So it's not so much the financial part. Hopefully the unemployment thing will come through, although that's a disaster here in Florida. I have not been able to get any unemployment insurance. I was just denied, and I don't know why. I'm like
Keep trying.
25% of all people. Yeah. I don't know why. I have to wait for a letter, and then
The
you can appeal.
system is designed to fail.
Yeah. So I'm like 25% of the people that were deemed ineligible this past weekend, and I'm waiting for the letter to find out why. But separate from that, it's just like you lose your community. So like what I was doing during the quarantine was getting up and getting online and spending, you know, from 9 in the morning till 1:30 with this group of people, and we're all like helping each other through, and let's use this time to really improve. And like when who was down, the next one helped them out, and reading things together. And then all of a sudden that's gone. You're like, okay, what do I do with my time now? So I'm still tutoring some of them for free just because we're a community. But it's, I have to figure out what I'm going to do now. Like my days seem really long.
Doreen, do you think you'll be able to have your job once the quarantine's off? Like, do you think it'll go back to normal for your situation?
I don't think so, because international students aren't going to come to the United States anytime soon.
Right.
You know, we're only 5% of the world's population or something like that, and we're more than 25% of the deaths that are reported so far. Mm-hmm. And while South Florida isn't the epicenter, I don't see people coming back here very soon. I don't see people traveling long distances very soon. I don't see this world going back to the way it was very soon. So I don't know.
Well, Doreen, you asked, like, what are you going to do with your time? And I'll say it again. you're going to get together with your friends as we're doing now, okay?
That's right.
I'm doing a lot of that, and I'm, like
And
doing
I
a lot of
already
tutoring.
threatened you. I'm going to treat you to a coffee in the morning, because we tried to have a coffee in the afternoon, but the places were closing early in mid-afternoon. So we'll get out and do that. And I'm just pulling your leg that, yeah, we're all here, and we're here to help each other and support each other.
Thank you.
And
I
same,
think you're right, Doreen. I've heard the same thing, that there's going to be a lot of even more cuts in education because of the revenues going down so much now.
And I will eventually, figure it out and probably teach online to Chinese kids or Russian execs or whatever. But it's not the same as having the in-person experience. Because we've had an experience, all of us, in person, I think you have a stronger relationship when you get online. But if you haven't had that not online experience first, maybe you can develop it, but I don't think it's as easy.
Doreen, will you help improve my English, please? Actually, I don't know if it's going to happen, but I have a flight reservation. I go down to Brazil in 3 weeks, and it looks like things are going to be okay. Even though things are heating up in Brazil, that's more in Sao Paulo and not so much in the mountain community that I go to. But when I come back at the end of the summer, my English is going to be horrible, Doreen. So
I'm sure it's going to be great.
What part of Brazil will you be in, Ben?
It's called Minas Gerais, which is north of Sao Paulo and west of Rio. It's a big landlocked state the size of Texas.
Okay, nice.
So, but I'll be thinking of you guys, and obviously, let's hope and pray. But I think by September, I hope that we'll be meeting. Maybe Miriam's not back yet, but that we'll be at the Wolf and meeting in person. But if not, we can do another Zoom book club meeting again. But soon enough, we'll be able to give each other hugs.
Yeah.
Your lips to God's ears.
Yes, your lips to God's ears. That's right.
And Miriam, when do you come back if things clear up?
Well, we don't know. It's really absolutely uncertain right now. Ordinarily, we'd probably be coming back in October, but now we're not so sure. And then they're doing some renovation of the balconies in our building. So many uncertainties. We really don't know. But with luck, maybe in October. So does this mean that we will not be Zooming in June or?
Yeah, no. Normally we take a break over the summer,
Okay.
and I mean, if you guys want to go ahead and do something, I tend to get a little distracted when I'm down in Brazil with other things. So to organize the books and organize the times, it's now physically conceivable because of Zoom.
Yes.
But I don't know. You guys decide if you'd like to put together a list, go through the normal process, but to have a book or two this summer, then let's do it.
That's a thought. Let me think about that. Yeah.
I'd be open to that. I mean, I have more time now than I usually do. There's no commuting.
Yeah. Lynn?
I probably could use the break. I feel like I've gotten busier too I was like trying to beat the clock to get this book done.
Yeah.
Because I have other things going on, but
what we can
we'll see.
Send a email to the group and see who's interested.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think probably a lot of it depend on the book or books, and because certain books you kind of make time for if they're like right up your alley.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah.
And you know what the secret to that is? come up with a really good book suggestion that you want to read, and then it gets voted in, and then motivation is high.
Yeah, you got to look for that universal appeal, though.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, Mar-a-Lago was not my favorite book of the book club so far, and so we were lacking in that many good options this spring. So
how many people were there for that event?
well, it was Zoom. It was the same as this. I think we had 5 people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the author.
Yeah, that's true.
Or the author.
Yeah. So that was a real treat to have the author there.
I enjoyed that book. I thought it was interesting to learn the history of that.
Yeah, yeah. It's just that for me, I mean, it's very good nonfiction, but there aren't extra layers to it. You have the story of what happened, and all of the rich and famous people who helped it to happen. And I love learning about Florida history, so don't get me wrong, but it just wasn't my cup of tea for longer discussions. But that's great. So what we need to do is I'll send out an email, but then already put on thinking caps on what kind of book you'd like to read, because that really the quality of the suggestions are what makes or breaks these meetings.
Okay.
Well, maybe we can come up with something before you go, before you take off, and unless somebody else wants to facilitate that process, maybe just to help us see if there is one or two that people vote, and we'll see how many people want to participate.
Yeah, I agree. What you and Miriam are saying is I'll put out a feeler by email.
Yes.
And we'll see how many people react and say, you know what, I'd like to try that. We do have a few Luddites who write me and say, you know what, I don't really want to do the technology.
Yeah.
But let's do that, because it's actually, particularly now that I changed my router, because the last meeting I was fading in and out with a bad internet connection. It was always unstable. This one was rather nice. And Zoom works. You don't even get the idea that you're talking over other people. So the technology is good.
Very good. Well, Mark, it was good to see you. It was good to see you, Lynn. Good to see you, Doreen, and Ben, especially you as well, with thanks for doing all of this. And we'll see if anybody responds to your email. It was lovely to get together. It was certainly better than binge watching.
Watching.
And Miriam, I felt that we were so honored to get an Alcott specialist to join us this evening. You've actually written on her.
I say that I'm a specialist, but I did do a book on writers' homes in New England, and of course Orchard House was one of them. And so I felt I got to know Louisa May Alcott. I got to know a lot about her. Those of you might be interested. She wrote a book about her based on her experiences in the Civil War. It's called Hospital Sketches. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to read as well.
And what is your book called?
That one, that's a Guide to Writers' Homes in New England.
Can we access it digitally? So any way we can go and take a look at the Alcott chapter easily?
It's not. It's not on Kindle or anything. It's an older book. My more recent book is a collection of poetry. But if I could scan it maybe and send it to people, it's just a few pages. Let me see if I can do that. If I can, I will send it.
That's so kind of you. How interesting.
You can always use your phone. Just take pictures.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Maybe I can zip it to her. I think she died at 55.
Wow.
Alcott, and she was absolutely remarkable. Especially her struggle to rescue her family.
Yeah, and you think she was cohorting with a group of very powerful men.
Absolutely.
So she was an extremely powerful woman. My hat off to her.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
And the fact that she went to the Civil War, I mean, it's a very affecting story. She contracted, she worked as a nurse, and then became ill with typhoid, and the treatment at that time was to dose people with, I think it was called calomel, and it was loaded with mercury, and she was, you know, poisoned by that. But she wrote on. I mean, Little Women was written certainly after that. So her what do we? Everybody loves that term now, work ethic, right? Well, she was a tremendous worker. And of course, she wrote fair copy and no typewriter. And she had to use a brace on her hand because she wrote so much. But she was really, really remarkable. Very much Joe, lots and lots of spirit.
What a role model for all of us. Thank you for sharing that.
Definitely.
Yeah, just tremendous, tremendous. And the pictures, if you look her up on Wiki, the picture that they have of her doesn't quite do her justice. I'll see if I can take a picture of that and send that to you as well.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I appreciate you all. I really do.
Thanks, Ben. It was lovely seeing everyone. This was awesome.
Yeah.
This was a nice Friday evening. Thank you for pulling it together.
Beautiful.
Thanks, everybody.
And
Yes,
thanks for reading the 400.
Best of luck to everyone.
Yeah, and thanks for reading the 400-page book and one that's rather old. So thank you. You guys are great.
And it ended up being, I so enjoyed it. So that was a very pleasant surprise.
Everybody be well.
Take care. Stay safe.
Take care,
All
everyone.
the best.
All right.
Bye all.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.